in 2021, he did something that should go down in infamy as one of the ugliest and most cynical moves a Canadian prime minister has ever pulled. He called a snap election in 2021, bringing Canadians to the polls in the middle of a pandemic. Now, the reason I think that's significant is because the Trudeau Liberals had been hectoring people for the duration of the pandemic: wear masks, stay apart from each other, save lives, stay home, get vaccinated. And then why did they insist on spending an enormous amount of money that the Canadian government could ill afford and can less afford now in order to drag Canadians out for the polls? It's because Trudeau thought that if he campaigned on vaccine mandates, he could demonize a minority of the Canadian population, he could stoke up fear in the majority of the Canadian population, and that he could eke out a majority government that would give him another 4-year mandate. So what happened was, he calls a snap election. The majority of Canadians got vaccinated, a minority didn't. And he traveled around the country giving these truly ugly speeches. Some of these speeches are really foam-flecked rants about how if you're unvaccinated, you don't have the right to sit next to another Canadian on a train or a bus or a plane. And what he tried to do was stoke all of the anxiety and fear that Canadians were feeling during this very uncertain time, during this very weird period where, major city streets were abandoned in the middle of the day, where we were getting stay-at-home orders. And Trudeau thought that he could use that fear and anxiety and he could turn it into anger towards a minority of Canadians. And that by tapping into that anger, he could give himself a majority government. That is the play that he ran in 2021. And Canadians have been more divided ever since. It's worth remembering now when you see Trudeau answering questions outside Rideau Cottage to journalists claiming that Pierre Poilievre seeks to divide and he's a fearmonger and a scaremonger. It's all garbage. Nobody has been more cynical and more divisive than Justin Trudeau. Obviously, every politician divides to a certain degree because they're trying to divide Canadians along ideological lines and drive up voter intensity amongst their people. That's part of the process. But what Justin Trudeau did was he tried to demonize a group of Canadians just for the purpose of directing the ire of other Canadians at those people to give him a political mandate. And he has not gotten nearly enough opprobrium for that. He has got, I think honest historians will call this out for what it was. If we were supposed to take the pandemic as seriously as Justin Trudeau said that we should have, then his actions during that pandemic were absolutely unforgivable. And then there's, over the last couple of days, I noticed, and this was truly sickening to see. So Trudeau's got this diehard, sometimes I think they're fake paid for bots because the stuff they say is so ludicrous. They're either totally disconnected for reality or somebody's paying them to say this stuff. But there's all these bots on X who are basically defending Trudeau and mourning his departure. And I suppose him resigning in front of Rideau Cottage is somehow even worse than seeing him leave 24 Sussex with Pierre Poilievre's boot print on his backside. But that aside, one of the things they're giving him credit for is that he ably led the country through the pandemic. And this really is just, a really nauseating joke because Trudeau's decision to call an election and campaign on vaccine mandates divided the country so starkly that what he ended up doing was triggering the Freedom Convoy, in which hundreds and hundreds of semi-trucks and other vehicles headed to downtown Ottawa, the capital city of Canada, in early 2022, and they set up camp and they stayed there for weeks. I was on the ground there. I covered that story on the ground. And instead of talking, Trudeau invoked the Emergency Measures Act. Now, to give you some context for the Emergency Measures Act used to be called the War Measures Act, and it's essentially a declaration of martial law. The last time the War Measures Act was declared, it was his dad, Pierre Trudeau, Trudeau the Elder, and it was declared during the 1970 FLQ crisis when separatist terrorists in Quebec had kidnapped multiple people. They murdered 2, James Cross and Pierre Laporte. And this was at the tail end of a separatist campaign of domestic terrorism lasting from 1963 all the way to 1970, in which 8 people died. And so that, even to this day, the declaration of the War Measures Act in 1970 is hotly debated. I remember there being huge debates about this, even in my university level history courses, And so that's debated to this day. Well, Trudeau declared essentially the new version of the War Measures Act, the Emergency Measures Act, because of vehicular civil disobedience taking place in downtown Ottawa. And they tried desperately to smear these people as domestic terrorists. There was no violence whatsoever. There was not a single instance of scuffling, of punching, of assault, of guns turning up. No indication whatsoever that this was an insurrection or a far-right demonstration of any sort. And if there had been any evidence, it would have been on the front page of every Canadian newspaper in the entire country. Trudeau would have called press conferences. They would have talked about it. So the reason you know there was nothing is because if they'd had it, they would have talked about it incessantly. And yet he declared the Emergency Measures Act, and he sent in cops on horseback to clear the streets. That's what Justin Trudeau did. That is how he ably handled the pandemic. And when a federal Canadian court declared that he had violated the basic rights of Canadians, keep in mind, he also had their bank accounts frozen, essentially deeply damaging Canadian trust in their own institutions, their banking institutions. He said he disagreed with the court's decision. Now, why is that important? Because Trudeau is one of these guys who constantly claims to be defending norms, right? Disruptive guys like Trump, they are constantly challenging norms, but Trudeau is an upholder of norms. And so, therefore, questioning the judgment of a federal court, you might think, would be questioning norms. And if a conservative did this, he would be foaming at the mouth. But no, when Trudeau does it, it's fine. Why? Because Trudeau is a rule unto himself. And unfortunately, the rest of the country just happened to experience that differently. Trudeau's euthanasia regime as well has turned basically it's an international horror show. Canada was front and center during the debate in the UK with people pointing at Canada saying, look at what happened there. This is something that we need to avoid doing. And since 2016, when Trudeau's government passed their legislation on euthanasia, 60,000 Canadians have been euthanized. 60,000 Canadians have died at the end of a needle. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, euthanasia, assisted suicide, it's something people choose, and so this has nothing to do with Trudeau's Canada. Well, one, Trudeau's government set the eligibility standards and been relentlessly trying to expand them ever since. The initial legislation in 2016 has now been far exceeded, and the Trudeau government tried for several years to expand the eligibility requirements to include mental illness as a sole motive for assisted suicide. But now there's been international stories, almost weekly, that Canadians have been euthanized because they can't access the healthcare they need, including people who could not get treatment for the cancer that was treatable and waited so long, eventually they opted for a lethal injection instead. Canadians who got euthanasia because mental health supports are unavailable. There's Canadians who have written posthumous letters to newspapers saying, I would have stuck around if there had been more care, but I simply could not get the care that I need. Canadians have been euthanized because disability assistance in this country is almost impossible to get. Reports of impoverished Canadians desperately opting for assisted suicide actually prompted the far left-wing Toronto Star newspaper to dub this regime, quote, Hunger Games-style social Darwinism. Give you one more statistic to really highlight this point and highlight the fact that when Pierre Poilievre says everything is broken, he's not far off. Around half of the 15,300 people who opted for assisted suicide in 2023 cited fear of being a burden as one of their motivations for accepting a lethal injection. Fear of being a burden. Now, Canadians are notoriously apathetic because Canada is a multicultural or very balkanized country in many ways, and many communities are looking primarily at their own interests, and thus Canadian politicians can actually get away with a lot more than American politicians can, and they can get away with a lot more than politicians in other countries. And so it's entirely possible that Canadians might have forgiven everything that I just said if it wasn't to add to that the Trudeau government was manifestly incompetent on every file that affects the day-to-day way that Canadians live. There was a journalist from the National Post who commented, it's really easy to write these long-form analyses of why is this broken in Canada and why is that broken in Canada. But the really simple explanation, actually, is that there was an enormous number of people who simply didn't know how to do their jobs in charge of really important portfolios, starting at the very top with the boy Prince Justin Trudeau himself. Let's look at a few examples again. Canadians are now utilizing food banks in record numbers. Millions of people were using food banks last year. In March of 2024, there was over 1 million people that used food banks. The 2024 numbers show a 90% surge in Canadians using food banks since 2019 because the cost of living has gone so high. The cost of living that Chrystia Freeland called a vibe session. In other words, we just feel that things are more expensive. It's not that we can't afford more stuff. It's that we feel we can't afford more stuff. And so it was a pretty strong vibe session because people, were driven by these vibes to line up outside of food banks and to actually ask for charitable gifts of food because they couldn't afford it. But I don't know, Chrystia Freeland's probably feeling some entirely different vibes these days herself. Then there's the country's housing crisis, which has made Canada one of the most unaffordable places in the world to live. And housing is now so expensive in almost every province in the country, unless you want to live in the tundra somewhere, that Canadians are pretty much priced out of the market. And 2 generations of Canadians can't afford to buy a home in the country where they were born, or can't afford to buy a home in the city where their parents live. Part of this is because of the massive influx of immigration that has been facilitated by Justin Trudeau. Now, Canadians were never quite as pro-immigration as governments liked to claim, but there was kind of a consensus. There was a really narrow way of bringing immigrants in, but also ensuring that the services and the housing was available, etc. Trudeau broke that beyond belief. The CBC, the BBC, the CTV, even the Globe and Mail are publishing these think pieces on how Trudeau broke the immigration consensus here in Canada because a low estimate of people that Trudeau brought in puts it at over 3 million people. This in the middle of a cost of living crisis, in the middle of a housing crisis. And then, of course, we've all gotten a pretty good glimpse of what some of those newcomers think, with rallies celebrating the terrorist attacks in which Israeli women, men, and children were raped and murdered and burned to death. And so, yeah, Canadians aren't too enthused about that either. It's not quite accurate. One take a lot of people really are drawn to is that Canada is maybe going to experience a sort of populist upheaval where Pierre Poilievre gets elected because Canadians are rejecting woke. And I don't think that's quite accurate. I think it's probably true to say that millions of Canadians have been turned off of wokeness for a generation by Justin Trudeau. But really, I think at this point, Canadians are simply voting in self-defense. If you look at the comments on social media, the comments on news articles, if you look at the generic reaction to his resignation, this man is leaving being mourned by nobody. And it's an incredibly unifying and bipartisan moment to see how few Canadians are sad to see the back of this man who thought that we didn't deserve him because he, of course, is a uniquely talented and gifted individual. And again, Canadians experienced that very, very differently. So I don't think that we're rejecting woke so much as recognizing that Canada simply can't afford more of Trudeau and simply can't afford more of the Liberal Party of Canada. And so what we're seeing right now isn't quite what we've seen in some European countries and elsewhere. Now, if you look at what's going to happen now, we're going to go through a leadership race. We're going to select a new prime minister. We're going to have 3 prime ministers this year because unless something radically changes, Trudeau is going to resign, turn the keys of 24 Sussex over to a new prime minister, and then Pierre Poilievre is going to devastate the Liberal Party in the next election, barring some completely unforeseen black swan event. In the meantime, to conclude this, though, Trudeau leaves 24 Sussex utterly unburdened by the love of Canadians, the respect of his international counterparts, and the dignity of even moderately competent leaders. And he no doubt hopes, when he looks back, that defining images of his reign is going to be, pictures of him pressing the flesh on the rope line on a campaign rally, or maybe clutching desperately the Ukrainian president. But I think the defining image of Justin Trudeau's reign in Ottawa should be photos of police on horseback advancing on working class Canadian protesters in the snow in the shadow of the Peace Tower on Parliament Hill. Thanks so much for joining us today. If any of you have any stories that we should cover, please drop a comment below. If you have any vigorous disagreement or heckling you'd like to do, please drop those comments as well. You can find our content wherever you download your podcasts. And if you found this content helpful, please do share the video or like it. Thanks so much for listening.